To the Catholic Challenge. I'm your host, Luke Lancaster, going through more evidence for Catholicism. We've gone through now evidence for God, evidence for the soul, evidence from archaeology for the reliability of the Bible. We've gone through evidence suggesting that the Gospels were in fact trying to deliver history, trying to deliver a biography of Jesus Christ. So they are reliable accounts there. And now we're going to try and go into the authorship of the Gospels. Were those Gospels, how do we know that they were reliable accounts? Like they're in the genre of Greco-Roman biographies, but who wrote them? Were they eyewitnesses, or were they just people who heard from a long train of thought or a long tradition from people that maybe corruptions got in there? Were they eyewitnesses? I think is a really key, important point there. So some people will doubt the authorship of the Gospels. So I'll ask you a question. Why do you believe that the Gospels were written by the traditional authorship, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Yeah, I believe that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The early Christians said that Matthew was an eyewitness disciple of Jesus who worked as a tax collector. And so in those days, tax collectors could write and were good at it. Their job demanded it.
Yeah.
And then Mark was a scribe for the eyewitness disciple of Jesus named Peter. So the scribe would write down whatever Peter would want him to write down.
Yeah, Peter was an eyewitness.
Yep. And then Luke was a disciple of St. Paul and was an educated physician. So that...
He'd be able to write.
Yeah, gives proof to why he'd write. And then John was an eyewitness disciple of Jesus and an educated member of the priesthood because he knew the high priest in John 18.
Yeah, the fact that St. John is able to get into the courtyard of the high priest. It says in John's Gospel, chapter 18, that the beloved disciple was able to see basically the Sanhedrin's decision on Jesus when they were trying to decide whether or not Jesus was guilty or not guilty before he ultimately was crucified. They are having this court of law hearing, and John, it says, was known by the high priest. If you were known by the high priest, you were probably a priest. In the early church, like you just said there, the early church said that St. John was a member of the priesthood. And if you're a member of the priesthood, you'd be educated, you'd be able to write. So it would make sense that he would write a gospel there. So I think that's key evidence there, that the Gospels were not just written by any random people, but they were in fact written by eyewitnesses, so their testimony can be considered reliable. It says in the Gospel of Matthew itself how Jesus met Levi, which his name was also Matthew. Right? So Matthew or Levi, oftentimes he'd have two names. Or in the fact in John's Gospel, it says in chapter 19, the fact that the beloved disciple saw these things, and he is the one who is writing them. Right? So an eyewitness of Jesus is trying to deliver to the world what he saw. Right? So reliable accounts there. What else about considering that authorship question?
Yeah, the early Christians were unanimous on the issue of authorship, saying that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by those authors. It is likely because they were educated enough to have written them.
Okay. Yeah.
And St. Justin Martyr, quote, "For the apostles in the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, have thus delivered unto us what was enjoined upon them."
Yeah, St. Justin Martyr, which we quoted earlier, says that the Gospels were the memoirs of the apostles. Right? The memoirs, that is a technical word there that's trying to be, he's trying to emphasize to the people that these are the recollections of eyewitnesses. These are the memories of what they saw, like the original apostles saw of Jesus, right? The things that he said, the things that he did. So their Gospels can be considered reliable testimony. So you quoted there St. Justin Martyr. He's super early, 150 AD. Is there anybody else that's...
Yeah. Tertullian of Carthage, he writes, quote, "I lay it down to begin with that the documents of the Gospels have the apostles for their authors, and that is this task of promulgating the Gospels was imposed upon them by the Lord himself. In short, from among the apostles, John and Matthew implant in us the faith, while from among them apostolic men, Luke and Mark, reaffirm him."
That's a Tertullian of Carthage. And he was a very, very popular early Christian writer. He, in fact, references the Gospels so often that you might even be able to piece together the Gospels just from Tertullian's writings. The fact that he knew them so intimately. And he's not very far removed from Jesus Christ, from the original apostolic men. He's only like maybe a third generation Christian, writing between, what does it say in there, like 160 to 225 AD. He's a very early writer. Right? So he's an ecclesiastical writer there. All right, so we've got the early Christians all saying, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were eyewitnesses. They were recollecting what they saw. So that's why we hold to those authors and that their testimony is reliable. What about people who might say that they're not, they couldn't have been written by them because maybe they weren't educated?
Well, for those who say that, back in those days, it was acceptable and normal for authors to dictate verbally to a scribe, so a scribe could write it down. For example, Paul's letter to the Romans ends with, quote, "I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord," end quote, stating that he was the one that wrote that gospel, even though it was, or that letter, even though Paul was actually the author.
Yeah. I think that is a huge point that is often forgotten. The fact that in the early centuries, typically you wouldn't actually be writing. You would have a professional scribe, because the skill of writing was not very common back then. And so St. Paul, he's basically saying in his letter to the Romans that he could not write. He didn't have that skill of writing. He hired a man named Tertius. And Tertius there wrote out the letter to the Romans, and that was the typical manner of doing things. And so, if you were to suggest that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John couldn't have written the Gospels, you can't actually exclude that, but because of the fact that the normal way of writing was by dictation. You would just speak. We have that nowadays with our smartphones. We could just speak into it, voice to text, right? So they had a voice to scribe. So yeah, they were able to do that. So that's a good point there. Any other points for that?
Yeah, if the Gospels were written anonymously, then why did Jewish rabbis attempt to refute the Gospels of Matthew or John specifically? It's because they were written by Matthew and John. And it's because the Jewish scribes knew the authors of the Gospel. Yep. And not even one Jewish scribe, say from Egypt, claimed to refute a Gospel written by Nicholas.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point there. The fact that people who weren't even Christian knew of these Gospels, the big four there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they didn't refute the Gospel of Nicholas or anything like that, or the Gospel of Thomas. No, they knew the names. They were not anonymous. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that the Gospels were anonymous, and so they think that, well, is the testimony reliable or not? Was the testimony true about, can we really know what Jesus said and did? Well, the fact that the Jewish people, who obviously, they were not fans of Christianity, they were not Christians themselves. They were trying to prevent Jews from becoming Christians. But they knew who the authors were. They were able to refute such authors. And these Jewish scribes were from all over the Mediterranean world. The whole Roman Empire. You've got people from Egypt, Gaul, Asia Minor, Italy, etc. All these different places spread throughout the Roman world. These are Jewish writers trying to refute the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John. So they were a traditional authorship of them. I would also add manuscript evidence. Unfortunately, some people think that the New Testament was just changed over time because of tradition. They might think of the game telephone, where I might have some idea and I whisper it to you, and then you whisper it to the next person, the next person, the next person, the next person. And then once the last person says it, it's radically distorted from the original saying. So if I whispered, I go for runs, maybe it'll end up with something bizarre like I plant plants. Like the saying will just be distorted over time, and so people say, well, oral tradition. I mean, these stories about Jesus' existence and the teachings that he had, it probably went through that type of stream there of it just got distorted over time, so we can't actually know what Jesus said or did. But if that was the case, then why do we have so many manuscripts that all say the same thing? Why do we have 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament, and they're all substantially agreeing with each other? There would need to be a lot of distortions in all those manuscripts. They would all need to be saying something different if the message was truly being distorted over the centuries. But all the manuscripts that we have substantially say the same thing. It's like Luke chapter 17 is going to be the same whether it's in the 4th century or if it's in the 10th century. So the message wasn't being distorted. In fact, there's a really prominent book known as Fundamentals of New Testament Textual Criticism. I believe that was written, I can't quite remember the author's name, but anyways, he says this, quote, "Compared with other works of antiquity, the New Testament has far greater numerical and earlier documentation than any other book. Most of the available works of antiquity have only a few manuscripts that attest to their existence, and these are typically much later than their original date of composition, so that it is not uncommon for the earliest manuscript to be dated over 900 years after the original composition," close quote. So what they're trying to say there is that documents from maybe the 1st century, our first copy of it will be 900 years after that, because a lot of things did not survive antiquity. But that would mean that the New Testament, if it has 5,800 manuscripts, and they're all very frequently pretty darn close to the actual events, and we have, like I mentioned, Tertullian. Tertullian was writing around 100s, 200s AD. He quotes the Gospels so often we could probably repiece together the entire Gospels, all 4 of them, based on Tertullian's writings, right? So this would really indicate that the message has not changed. The teachings, the parables of Jesus, the Gospels have not been distorted over time. So I think that's a huge argument. And then another argument that is huge is oral tradition. We've got that game of telephone where the saying is just distorted over time. Well, the reason that saying is distorted over time is because it's being whispered. But the Gospels, like when the people saw Jesus Christ resurrected, and they were taught by him the parables that he gave, such as the Sermon on the Mount or the parable of the sower, these teachings were proclaimed. They were not whispered. They were proclaimed so that everybody could know about them. And according to Richard Bauckham, he's a professor out in England, I believe it's St. Andrews University. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony. And he says that oral-based cultures, they kept traditions substantially intact over the centuries. For the elders of the culture would guard the traditions and hand them on with the utmost care. Right? So that would imply to us that if oral-based cultures kept the teachings very, very guarded, and they only had certain people pass them on, and they did it with the utmost detail, trying to make sure that they passed on the teaching to the next generation to keep it intact, to keep it pure, that would imply that the stories about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection were in fact kept intact. So what we read about in the Gospels, we can read about them with incredible certainty of their reliability. Right, so that is huge for a lot of people who doubt the reliability of the Gospels. All right, so we've gone over a lot of evidence there. The next topic we're going to get into is the topic of the resurrection of Jesus. Many people don't believe in that, and some people think that there's no evidence for that there's no reason to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. So we're going to try and convince people that Jesus Christ did resurrect from the dead. We're going to go to a quick break, so I'll see you, listener, in just a moment.